I think it's about time that I tried to get this fired up for the first time. You can see that, you know, it's going slightly orange where the seams are. Squirted a load of sealer in. I've definitely come a long way with this engine since it was very kindly given to me by Chris. Hey, we've got no red light on the dash. Why is that? Hello and welcome to this video. I'm Marcus Hayes, and as I mentioned in the last video, in this video I think it's about time that I tried to get this 1300 crossflow lump in Heidi, my hearing aid beige model Mk2 Escort, fired up for the first time. Before that though, I've got a quick job I want to do on INSTA that should help her be more suitable for her current lifestyle as my practical daily driver. The weather is beautiful today in this part of England, but that wasn't the case yesterday. I drove this thing back home from the garage here yesterday evening in torrential rain. I literally had a puddle in the driver's side footwell, which isn't good, especially considering my plans years ago were to never drive INSTA in the rain. But yeah, that's just not realistic when you live in this country. Now, the water that came in yesterday into INSTA's footwell was after I went for a big puddle, so yeah, it's not surprising really. But you know what? She's never been super watertight. In the past, I've had to seal up the front windscreen when I noticed that water was coming in through these corners. And for a while now, to be honest, whenever I have been caught out and she's been driven in rain, I've noticed water collecting in that area there where you can see that I've got a microfiber cloth. But I've never been able to pinpoint exactly where it's coming from. But yesterday, I was able to see that it's actually coming in through the bottom corners of the rear screen. You can see that, you know, it's going slightly orange where the seams are, just where no paint has ever been in between those seams, right? You know, the car's welded together in the factory and then painted. Obviously, we cleaned things out as best we could before we repainted things Olympic blue. But yeah, basically now I can see that it is coming in through there. I noticed recently, or should I say my friend Gary Ball noticed recently, that this rubber isn't sitting properly and I can't get it to sit any better. So I have sort of wondered whether the water was coming in through there and just running down to here. But as I say, yesterday I confirmed that the water is literally coming in there and running down onto this sort of inner tub and then eventually making its way down to there. So today I'm going to seal up the rear windscreen. The stuff I'm going to use is this industrial and glazing silicone. This is black stuff, and this is exactly what I used when I did the front screen before, so this should be well up to the job. Now, although I'm tempted to just basically seal all the way around the windscreen, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to put it in the corners. If I lift up the rubber, I don't know if that's coming across on camera, but you know, there is a bit of a gap there. I've noticed a slight bit of surface rust appearing here as well. But you know, next time the rear screen comes out, I can deal with things a bit better. But yeah, I'm basically going to put it in the bottom corners. I'll probably go all the way along the bottom, and then I think I'm just going to hit the top corners, because it's normally the corners where the water gets in. It's actually quite close there. There's not much of a gap there, so maybe the top's all right. But yeah, I'll do the top corners, I'll do the bottom corners, and probably along the bottom. And yeah, hopefully that'll do a better job of keeping the rain out. I think the reason these cars leak, I mean, I've heard that they weren't super watertight when they were new, but nowadays, you know, these cars, and this car is no different, have pattern, you know, remade window rubbers. And obviously it's great that companies are making them, but I would guess that potentially the original Ford ones may have sealed a bit better in the past. The front windscreen on this car isn't even a genuine Ford one, and it's almost as if this screen was slightly too small. So that, along with the pattern rubbers, just means that this car isn't watertight. But the front windscreen has been watertight ever since I sealed it. So yeah, I'm hoping for the same results with the rear screen once I chuck this sealer in. I decided to use this squeegee, which is designed to apply decals and vinyl to cars. It's stiff enough to hold the rubber up, but soft enough to not damage the rubber or the paint on the car. Once I'd squirted a load of sealer into this bottom passenger corner of the rear windscreen, I then started making my way along the bottom of the windscreen. Once I'd got halfway along, I decided to lift the rubber up and just check that there were no gaps in the sealer. And then I continued on, but decided to ditch the squeegee and just use my finger to keep the rubber lifted. I grabbed the Kent Europe brake cleaner to clean up any excess sealer, and then repeated the whole process for the top corners of the rear screen. Alright, that seemed to go well. When I did the front screen, I actually ended up putting too much sealer on and it was just a nightmare cleaning it off. But this time I was kind of worried that I hadn't put enough on. But, you know, I lifted up the rubber and I could see that I've definitely got a thin line of it going all the way along. Got a little bit more in the corners, which is exactly what I planned to do. Now, when I was around this side, I did sort of give the windscreen a wallop, and then loads of water splashed out from inside. So there is still water in there. So, you know, it would have been more ideal to do this when it's completely dry, or, you know, in hindsight, maybe I should have gone round and banged each corner before I put the sealer in. But, you know, it's in now. Hopefully whatever water is left in there will evaporate as the sealer dries, and at the end of the day, as long as there's a bead in there that's a bit of a barrier, I'm sure this is going to make a massive difference, and fingers crossed it will actually make her completely watertight on the rear screen. Alright, time to see if we can get some life out of this puny little crossflow that's fitted to Heidi. I've definitely come a long way with this engine since it was very kindly given to me by Chris. He also gave me the 4-speed gearbox that's now fitted to this thing. And I ended up going further than planned with this engine, to be honest. But you know what? That's usually the case with my cars. If I was able to contemplate, for instance, how much work I ended up doing on INSTA years ago, then I simply wouldn't have even bothered starting the project. Now, that's an extreme example because she took about 15 years, I think it was, to get her on the road, in amongst me partying too much and stuff, admittedly. But yeah, the point is that a lot of the times I'll kind of fool myself into doing bits on the cars by hoping for the best, and then as I go further into the project, then, you know, I start sort of digging deeper and deeper and deeper. So with this engine, I ended up actually flushing out the water jacket because there was a load of crud in there, and fitted some new core plugs. The block was obviously painted, which was always the plan anyway, and I like to do my engine blocks silver because I think they show up oil leaks a bit more. The bottom end was re-gasketed, and I painted up some bits black that would normally be bare alloy, cast alloy, and as I say, done the block silver, whereas that would normally be black. Had things like the manifolds refurbished by my friends at Microblast Services. I was donated a freshly rebuilt carburettor very kindly by a subscriber. I've actually been sorted out loads of bits for this engine. More recently, I was given this alternator adjusting bracket. My good friend Dale gave me the other alternator bracket down there. And yeah, in general, this engine has just been tarted up, really. I haven't bothered changing any bearings in the bottom end. We did find that the stem seals in the cylinder head were perished, so my good friend Jonathan very kindly talked me through the process of rebuilding the cylinder head, and that was really cool, you know, getting stuck in and getting involved with actual proper engineering processes. And yeah, loads of the fixings have been zinc plated, the rocker cover has been colour coded with the car, etc, etc, etc. And there's actually more bits that people have offered me. There's a guy that said he's going to make me a fresh pair of HT leads. I think he's going to be at the Ford show at the weekend. There was one guy that actually said that he had one of these battery leads for me, and I can't remember who that guy was, and I'm unable to find the message. I think it was through Facebook that he messaged me. But yeah, massive thanks to you if you are watching. I did actually find one of these battery leads in amongst my electrical stuff. But yeah, you know, this engine has come a long way. As I say, I think it looks absolutely awesome, but it's time to see if we can actually get it running. Now, while I was around here yesterday, I hooked up this red wire, as I say. Another thing I've done, which loads of you said I need to do, is I've turned the solenoid around so that it's the correct way round. I kind of thought it looked better the other way, having the contacts on the back, but this red wire wasn't quite long enough, so I've put it how it's supposed to be. I've also hooked up this sort of earth wire arrangement, which I know isn't how it should be, but ultimately you need a lead coming from the block to the battery and from the inner wing here to the battery, and that's what we've got. I couldn't find the bolt that goes here, but I found one that's a bit too long, so I've sort of spaced it out with some nuts, so you know that'll create a good earth. To be honest, I didn't actually sand that bit of the block down, so hopefully that little castellated washer thing is biting in enough to get a good earth. But yeah, you know, I need to tidy up some wiring and do some tests on some wires, figure out which wires go where on the coil, and then, you know, hook up some sort of fuel line to a jerry can temporarily, and then I should be able to go for a first fire up. I cable tied the wiring loom to the battery tray to keep it out of the way, and then I realised that this brown wire needed to be attached to the inner wing with the earth. I always use these castellated washer things on earths just to make a better connection to the body. I needed to connect this black and yellow wire to the starter solenoid here, but it had the wrong connector on it. So I changed it for a normal spade terminal and plugged the wire in. The wire on the bottom of this starter solenoid is the trigger feed for the starter motor. That's a black and red wire. It was time to look at the coil wiring next, and after looking at some wiring diagrams and having a look on the internet, I learnt that this green wire coming from the distributor needed to be plugged into the negative side of the coil, but it didn't have a connector on it. Once I'd got a new connector on it and plugged it into the coil, I plugged this black and yellow wire into the positive side of the coil. This wire here is the positive feed for the whole car, so I attached that to the positive terminal on the battery. Alright, so I think I've now got all the wires hooked up that I need to in order to get this engine running, apart from one. I'm pretty sure there's another wire that needs to go on the plus side of the coil, and I'm pretty sure that it is this one down here. Now this has got a different end on it because I'm pretty sure the original coil would have just had like a threaded thing for this to slip onto, similar to, you know, what would have been going on with the original solenoid. You would have just seen me replace this for a normal spade terminal. But yeah, I'm at the stage now where I'm going to use my multimeter to check that I've got power everywhere I need it, and I'm basically going to use the multimeter to see if I can figure out if my theory is right with regards to this needing to go to the plus side of the coil. If it does turn out that it looks like I'm right, then I'll change that to a spade terminal and plug that in. So I'm going to switch my multimeter to this 20 here, and then if I flick the ignition on, you should see this thing come to life a bit. Okay, we've got no red light on the dash. Why is that? Right, let's see if we've got anything else. Indicators. Okay, nothing. I wonder if the battery's dead. Yep, we're showing 1.5 volts. Right, I'll just rob the battery from Maud, my other model, Mk2 Escort, and yeah, we'll try again. All right, we now have 12.6 volts, and we now have some life in the old girl. Got a battery light, well, oil pressure light that is. The reason we don't have a battery light as well is because the alternator isn't plugged in. We don't have an alternator. One thing I do want to quickly check though, this here will be for the coolant temperature, so that will plug in to there. If I quickly touch this to earth, if I can do that somehow, you'll see that the coolant temperature goes all the way up. So that wire's working, but yeah, we'll keep these out of the way. I definitely don't want this to touch the negative or the body. So with the ignition on, I can now test that wire that I think I need to also connect to the coil. Bang this on 20 again, put the red one on this wire, and then the black one can just go to an earth point. So this bolt over here will do. And we have 12 volts. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that this is the feed for the coil when the engine's running. But when the engine's cranking, the coil will get its power through that black and yellow wire, which connects to over here, I believe. I can test that actually. If we set this to ohmage down the bottom on that 200, and then I can test for continuity between that yellow and black wire and that yellow and black wire. And as you can see, we have continuity. Just realised actually this spade terminal is too big for that. What I can do is I'll just close it up with these pliers. Yeah, that's nice and tight now. Right, now I already know that this red and black wire works in terms of powering the solenoid for the starter motor when you turn the key to the starter position. I'm not going to do it now, but when I did it before, when this wire wasn't hooked up to the battery, that would click when you went to the starter position. But yeah, I'm not going to test that now because, you know, with all this hooked up, it will actually turn the engine, and you don't want to do that because there's no oil in it yet. So yeah, it looks like all the wiring for the solenoid is okay. I think I've got the coil wiring correct. Obviously, I now assume that I need to hook up this to the positive side, but what I can do is, when I try and start this, if it runs when the starter, when the key's on the starter position, because then the coil will be powered through that wire, but then when you turn the key off of the starter position, if the engine then won't idle, then I can be pretty certain that I need to hook this wire up to keep the coil powered when the key isn't in the starter position. So yeah, we'll worry about that after we've gone for the first start up, but there's still a few more bits I need to do before we can go for said first start up. With Heidi jacked up on the driver's side and with an axle stand under her chassis, I had slid the prop shaft into the back of the gearbox. This is a split prop, which means it's got a bearing halfway down that needs to be bolted to the underside of the car. Because Heidi doesn't have a diff fitted, I just cable tied the rear end of the prop shaft up to the bracket that holds the handbrake cable. I moved the axle stand to this front anti-roll bar mount, then I could pull the jack out of the way so that it wasn't going to be in my way whilst I filled the gearbox up with oil. Unfortunately, I realised that the filler plug was on the passenger side of the gearbox, but I was still able to get to it. So once I'd undone the filler plug, I just squeezed in as much as I could from my 1 litre oil can. The gearbox is supposed to take about 0.9 litres, so it'll be roughly right. And then with Heidi back on the ground, I just filled her engine up with oil and then wiped away the oil that I spilt. Alright, so we've now got oil in the engine and in the gearbox, and off camera, I've just hooked up some fuel lines. Now this car doesn't have a fuel line going from the fuel tank to the engine bay yet, but because this has a mechanical fuel pump, which you can see there, we can actually just, you know, hook it up to a jerry can essentially to try and get it running. And as you can see, I've got a jerry can down there on the floor. I've got a pipe going from there into the input of the mechanical fuel pump, and then I've got a pipe coming out of the outlet of the mechanical fuel pump, and that goes into the inlet of the carb, and I've got a fuel filter on here as well. This is the pipe that actually came with the engine when I got it. So in theory, when we turn the engine over, you know, that pump will do its thing and it will suck the fuel from the jerry can and yeah, spit it into the carb. I put a bit of tape around this union on the inlet manifold because this is the bit that should be hooked up to the servo. I probably could have just hooked up a pipe to that, to be honest, but there you go. This other bit here is where coolant goes through, and obviously we haven't got any coolant or any radiator hooked up at the moment. So yeah, this should in theory fire up. Now admittedly, in an ideal world, I should probably go back and double check that the ignition timing is somewhere near, you know, maybe even double check my work with the valve clearances. So yeah, some might say that I'm being a bit hasty just going for a start up, but yeah, I think I'll just go for it, and then if it doesn't start, then I can start looking at, you know, potential reasons why. But there is one thing I do want to quickly have a look at, and that is the idle mixture on the carb. I think normally people say have this about 1.5 turns out. If we wind this all the way in, that's all the way in, half, 1, 1.5, and we'll also make sure that this idle screw, the idle speed screw, is leaning on that mechanism, which it actually is. It's yeah, it was just barely leaning on it, so that'll be fine. We don't have a throttle cable hooked up or anything, but you know, you can rev it like this. I think what I will do first is just confirm that we can get fuel to the carb, and whilst I'm doing that, that should in theory at least get some oil pumping around the engine as well. So we'll unplug the HT lead, or the King lead, from the coil. So that's going to mean that, you know, the spark plugs aren't going to fire. And then we'll turn the key and see if we can get some fuel in the carb. Well, the engine definitely turns over, so that's a good sign. I'm going to do this very carefully and patiently. Yeah, just want to keep an eye on the fuel hoses and stuff whilst I'm turning it over. Now, if I pump this, all right, there's definitely no fuel in there yet. So the hose definitely in the fuel. Yep, bottom of it's wet. Yeah, this might take a while to actually get the fuel to suck up by the pump. But it should come out of that little jet there. Despite turning the engine over for ages and ages, I just wasn't able to get fuel to make its way to Heidi's carb. Right, I think what might be a better idea, because I'm worried that this battery is just going to die before we actually get fuel sucked up. Now, obviously, this pump's going to work a lot better if the engine's running. So I think I'm actually going to pour a little bit of fuel into the carb. Obviously, I'll hook the King lead back up, and yeah, we'll see if it will start that way. Well, I'm calling that a success. Now, it won't run once the starter isn't engaged anymore, which was kind of what I expected. So I think the next step is to get a spade terminal on this thing, hook it up to the positive on the coil, and yeah, and then we'll run it again and see if we can actually get this pump to pump the fuel so that it will keep itself running, because at the moment it's not pumping any fuel in. All right, she is hooked up. Let's see how she runs now. All right, let's go out with the idle mixture screw a bit, just half a turn. Let's go in with the idle speed screw a little bit, half a turn. Despite keeping the engine running in this clip for about 20 seconds, I still wasn't able to get the fuel pump to pump the fuel to the carb. The fuel pump just wasn't doing its job. I do wonder if this filter has to be a certain way round. I sort of blew through it from both ways and it sort of didn't seem like it had to be a certain way round, and there's no markings on it, but let's see. No, the fuel hasn't got to here. There is one thing that isn't hooked up that should be. This vacuum needs to be hooked up to the dizzy onto there. That should do. Now that's only for the vacuum advance, to basically advance the ignition timing as the revs go up. So it's not going to make it run any better really while we're just trying to get it running, but you know, it is something that should be hooked up. Sorted. All right, got the jerry can on a bit of wood. I'm pretty sure that pipe is in the fuel, but you know, it definitely will be now. After yet more attempts trying to turn the engine over on the starter, there was still no fuel at the carb. And even after running it by putting the fuel in the top of the carb, I still wasn't able to get the fuel pump to do its job. I even rearranged my fuel bottle so that I had a smaller bottle higher up, just to see if that would work better. But still, no luck getting the fuel pump to do its job. I pulled the fuel hose off of the back of the fuel filter and turned the engine over just to see if I could sort of feel the pump pushing air towards my thumb, but I couldn't feel anything at all. In this clip, I had the engine running for quite a while by pouring fuel into the top of the carb, but still the fuel pump wouldn't pump the fuel to the carb itself. It was still cool to hear Heidi's engine run for the first time. Alright guys, please excuse my nakedness. I spilt a load of petrol on myself when I was transferring it from one container to the other, and I don't have a spare top with me. But yeah, I just had to leave the garage quite sharpish because I've got a boxing class this evening and I don't want to miss it. But I think we can say that Heidi is alive-ish. She's running, but it seems like I need a new fuel pump. But, you know, the engine runs when you pour the fuel into the carb. So, yeah, that's kind of everything else ruled out pretty much apart from the fuel pump. So, with a fuel pump, you know, I'm confident that it will run absolutely sweet. Now, of course, without an exhaust fitted, it's very loud. So it's kind of hard to hear exactly what the engine sounds like. And crossflows are normally always a bit rattly, a bit tappety. And I was kind of expecting to be able to hear a little bit of that crossflow rattle, you know, that crossflow tappet noise, but I definitely couldn't. Again, we won't know until we've got an exhaust on it and stuff, and you know, when the exhaust manifold isn't making a racket because there's no exhaust fitted, then we can definitely, you know, hear exactly what the engine sounds like. But you know, from what I know of the car that Chris took the engine out of, because I know that car myself from years and years and years ago, you know, it was sitting for 20 years that I know of. So I'm pretty confident that engine is quite low mileage. Obviously the cylinder head was rebuilt, but we didn't touch the bottom end. But yeah, so far so good. You know, the fact that it's got a brand new carburetor on it means that there's no, you know, potentially no issues in terms of the carburetor not working, and yeah, we kind of proved that today. I'm sure, you know, I'm going to have to tweak the idle mixture screw, tweak the idle speed screw. You know, we'll have to play around with the ignition timing once I've got a timing light on it. But when you haven't got fuel getting to the carburetor, all that stuff is kind of irrelevant. But yeah, today went, you know, as good as I could have hoped, you know. Now, next on the agenda for Heidi is definitely going to be some more bodywork. You know, I want to dive back into that. I just wanted to have a little bit of a break from it and see if we can get the engine started, and we did. So yeah, definitely going to dive back into Heidi's bodywork, as I say. But more importantly, over the next few days, is to get this thing ready for the Ford show at Santa Pod, which is this coming weekend. I do need to chuck a load of sealer on the rear wheel bearings. I actually had an email from someone today saying that they believe that the rear wheel bearings are actually the wrong way round on the shafts, which kind of would make sense, because if they were the other way round, the O-ring would be deeper into the axle casing. But I think the answer really is to get some better bearings that don't have the O-rings. But for now, I'll chuck a load of sealer on them. That should get me to Santa Pod, and hopefully we can get this thing down the quarter mile and finally see what it's capable of. Oh look, we've got a bit of rain coming, which is not great, seeing as that sealer on the rear windscreen probably isn't fully cured yet, although, you know, it's had a good few hours, but it is what it is. So yeah, not sure whether the next video is going to be Santa Pod, or whether the next video is going to be me diving into more bits on Heidi, or yeah, more bits on this, who knows. But stay tuned to the channel to find out. For now, I am going to end this video here. Massive thanks, as always, to everyone who's tuned in. Do check the links in the description to follow me on social media. I've got a link to my website down there for anyone who wants to grab some official Marcus Hayes merchandise. I'll also leave a link to Petrolhead Style in the description, which is my company that supplies other cool car-themed clothing and products. My email address will be in the description, as usual, for anyone who wants to contact me. Massive thanks, as always, to my patrons for your ongoing support. But other than that, until next time, thanks for watching.